Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder and sieve it through the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet, you try to act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged.
But people have got to believe that. What's the point?
You need to believe in things that aren't true. How else can they become?
That was Terry Pratchett's Discworld's Death. For the record, my favorite fictional death that doesn't dress like this. And what he's talking about here is the idea of social constructs. Yeah, I know. Trans, gender, social constructs. I can see the warning bells ringing, and I just want to be clear from the start that the topic that has immediately jumped into most of your minds isn't actually what I'm going to be talking about. Social constructs are a large and complex idea, and they're relevant to a ton of topics completely unrelated to gender being fake. It is fake, though. See, there's a question. A very old and very powerful question. It was with us when we first stepped out of our caves into the sun, and will remain when, with a grim inevitability, night comes for us at last. Are trans women really women? Are trans men really men? But that question's a bit played out, isn't it? Kind of basic. I don't think we need to waste our time with it here. Plenty of people before me have devoted their time and energy towards finding the answer, and I think their conclusions stand on their own. It is yes, though. The answer is yes, obviously. I just wanted to make sure we were all... It is yes. Anyways, the question that I find myself far more concerned with is something of a more dangerous one. I mean, let's not get too dramatic or anything. Rocco's Basilisk is dumb as fuck. Ideas aren't a threat on their own, and I don't have enough of a platform to cause that much harm with them, even if they were. I'm not going to ramble on here about my own influence and self-importance. If you wanted to watch me jerk myself off, you should have looked me up on a different website. That being said, we're going to be dealing with a few higher tier trans concepts, and I'd suggest anyone who's a bit less initiated to do some research on their own before moving forward. In short, trans rights. We've got a few ideas to cover here, so let's get into it. Pronouns. There is a common misconception that I've seen fairly frequently, whether directly or implicitly, and that is that pronouns and gender are the same general concept. She, hers are women, he, hims are men, and they, thems are the third gender, non-binary people. That, to be clear, that was a joke intended to highlight how dumb I think that idea is. I don't think we should just move from a gender binary to a gender trinity. The mistake that people make here is conflating an aspect of gender expression with gender in its entirety. Using a particular pronoun may be a facet of gender behavior, but a single facet does not a full and complex gender identity make. If we can agree that men can wear dresses without magically losing their ability to identify as such, we should be able to do the same for women, choosing to go by he, him pronouns. Or indeed the inverse. Non-binary people, or more accurately, some non-binary people, have this down with the whole neo-pronoun thing, but we don't spend a lot of time considering that binary people with complicated relationships with their gender could use neo-pronouns just as easily. But, okay, you read the title. You know the deal. We're not just talking about neo-pronouns here, we're talking about what is possibly the most controversial personal pronoun within trans circles. It's as personal identification. So let's put some skin in the game. I myself am actually quite partial to it pronouns. So partial, in fact, that, well, that's right. I'm not one of the respectable ones. I'm a degenerate tranny after all. Though you could have probably gathered that from the video where I talk about wanting to get railed by Pinhead. Nailed. It's funnier if I say nailed, because of or pinned down, pinned against a wall, pinned. Anyways, I use she, her pronouns with family and employers and the government and, cis people, and it's with anyone I know who has at least a few perks invested in the gender ideology skill tree. And now the internet, I suppose. So now that I'm personally invested, let's get into why. I know that there are several non-binary people who prefer it over they because of the clear lack of ambiguity. They can be plural or generic, but using it for a specific person is a far clearer indication of a departure from binary identification. But I'm not 100% non-binary. I'm also a trans woman, and my use of the word tranny earlier up in the video was a very deliberate one. The word it isn't exactly a slur in the same way that the T word is, but I'd be lying if I said no one has ever called me that as a direct result of my being a trans woman. If it's going to happen, I'd prefer it was a result of my own identification rather than someone else's bigotry. And I'm a terrible bitch who enjoys making cis people uncomfortable. At the end of the day, it comes down to reclamation. But there's another reason. The central focus of this video, really. And before I say it, I'd like to assert once more, just to be sure, that I believe all trans people are valid in their identities and that we should fight tooth and nail for our liberation. I think we should be more accepting of its pronouns, because members of the trans community aren't human beings, nor are we people, and no, those aren't the same thing.
The best episode of Star Trek that isn't Darmok is the 9th episode of the 2nd season of The Next Generation, and it is titled The Measure of a Man. In it, Data, the Enterprise's resident android, is put on trial to determine his rights and protections under the law. Does he have the legally recognized personhood to object to a potentially fatal assembly in the name of scientific progress, or is he a machine? Interesting little binary there, isn't it? Now, the episode is a fairly transparent allegory for slavery, with Whoopi Goldberg even having to spell it out for our dear Captain Picard, but I think the metaphor works pretty well if we're talking about trans issues as well. See, Star Trek is particularly fond of a trope in which our heroes, in the course of an episode, experience two distinct types of victory. There's the simple, material one. They save the day, complete the peace talks, achieve their objective. But then there's the moral victory, wherein our villain of the week admits that they were wrong all along, or else has their ideology ultimately disproven. Sure, Data wins the trial and gets to keep his positronic brain intact, but the moral victory comes a few seconds later when Bruce Maddox, the scientist so intrigued with this assembly, for the first time in the episode, doesn't fucking misgender him. He calls Data he rather than it. Anyways, I seem to have gone off on a tangent. The point here is in the ultimate conclusion of the episode and the specific ruling that is given.
Is Data a machine? Yes. Is he the property of Starfleet? No.
The line, very deliberately, is drawn between Data's humanity and his personhood, breaking the binary established earlier in the episode. He can be a man without being a human one, much as he himself might be disappointed by that fact. Alright, I know, we're talking about real shit here. Why am I rambling on and on about Star Trek? Other than just a general, unquenchable desire to speak endlessly on Data and the feelings he stirs in me, the fact is, if we're sticking to material reality, there aren't very many examples of people who aren't human beings. There's the argument to be made that the term could apply to particularly intelligent animals, corvids and such like, but there's hardly any sort of universal consensus on that. At the end of the day, I'd say the real distinction is a linguistic one. Personhood is a social construct, defined by universal agreement, while humanity is a biological one, based on DNA makeup and observable physiology. But what actually makes something human? We can all sort of agree on the basic consensus that everyone is a member of the human race, but that's not the same as coming up with a defensible argument as to why. To answer this particular question, I'm going to go a little ways out of my comfort zone. See, for anyone who's not aware, I'm a creative writing major. I was pre-med for a single year in which I studied biology, but after 3 rounds of intro classes that I could barely stay awake in, and the realization of why exactly I was so set on performing gender confirmation surgery specifically, I moved on to areas more suited to my particular skill set. I am not, nor will I ever be, a biologist. But it's the information age. I have access to the internet, and I know how to conduct research. Besides, I've got a friend who actually knows what the hell they're talking about when it comes to this sort of thing. I'll be fine. Now, it's time for Corbin to say the word of the day. And that word is speciation. For the uninitiated, speciation is the process by which new species branch off of the old, forming their own distinct biological groupings. And the thing about speciation is, it's not always easy to tell when it happens. Biologists as a whole aren't 100% united on what is a distinct species and what simply represents some amount of interspecies variation. Where we're supposed to draw the line has sparked more debates, both civil and entirely uncouth, than near any of us would expect, and they're not really that much closer to coming up with a universal definition than they were when they started. The thing is, species doesn't work. Not really. It's a useful tool and a good approximation, but it really is just a human invention pasted over a far messier reality. It's like someone wearing a latex Halloween mask that doesn't really fit. The form of the thing is there, sure, but the real shape of it gets lost along the way. There aren't species. There are just organisms, and some of them are more similar than others. But we live in a world of hard edges and clear distinctions, of binaries, human or not. So we have species, and we have countless different ways to measure it. Personally, I think we should stick to the basics. I'm already out of my depths, and we haven't even started rolling out much of the big words. There are a couple of the more popular methods of species definitions that I'd like to look at, but before we begin, a question. A hypothetical that I think is appropriate for getting us all in the right headspace. Imagine a world, a future, in which technology has advanced to a terrifying degree. The human race can perform wonders of science and engineering. Then imagine a man, mid-40s, and suffering from a degenerative condition. He makes a decision regarding his treatment, untroubled by the cost due to the wonders of socialized medical care, and he steps into a chamber in his local hospital. Several hours later, he steps out with the heavy thud of a mechanized footstep. The uploading process is complete, and every biological component of his form has been replaced by smooth metal and complex circuitry. The personality is intact, but nothing of the flesh remains. Is he human? You could say yes, in which case feel free to disagree with everything else I have to say on the topic, but if he's not, if there's an amount of augmentation that can render someone born a human being into something else, then all we're really quibbling over is where to draw the line. Anyways, species, what are the differences between them? The biological species concept is probably the most commonly accepted one, so we'll look at it first. Species as defined as sets of interbreeding populations. You know, the ability to reproduce and create non-sterile offspring. It's hardly a universally applicable definition, but that's kind of my point. None of them really are. Anyways, the question with this one is fairly simple. I'm a woman, no? Could a cis man get me pregnant? Could we produce viable offspring? I mean, I'm being deliberately obtuse. I understand the nature of my own biology. But the thing is, I couldn't get a cis woman pregnant either. I don't fit within the human breeding population as a direct result of my nature as a trans woman. But that's only one of the definitions. Let's try another. The phonetic species concept is all about the observable phenotype of a group of organisms. And to be honest, I think it might be the crudest one we're working with. It really just boils down to, hey, I think these fuckers look pretty similar. So, do I look human? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, for now. The transhumanist surgeries and treatments that I really want out of life are either currently unavailable or not fully developed, but let's get a bit more granular. I presumably, though I haven't checked, have a set of XY sex chromosomes. Am I phenotypically similar to the average XY human? Would I be easily confused with one? Careful now. Hell, am I even phenotypically similar to your average XX human, considering that I'm non-operative? Sex differences are often accounted for with the model, but being trans isn't exactly the same thing. And then we have the recognition species concept. It's similar to the biological one, but it's a bit less focused on the genetic side of things and a bit more concerned with the social. Organisms that recognize each other as potential mates are members of the same species. Now that's interesting. Am I universally recognized as a potential mate by this population, considering that I'm openly trans? What percentage of straight men that would otherwise be attracted to me wouldn't even consider it? Lesbians? And what about the T for T phenomenon? For those who aren't aware, T for T is a term that finds its origins in the olden days of Craigslist personals. The sections, you see, for romantic or sexual liaisons were abbreviated using a fairly simple method. Men seeking men was shortened to M for M, men seeking women to M for F, and so on. So, T for T. Yes, it was a section on there, though to be honest, I never found it particularly populated. Trans people seeking other trans people. Sure, it's a bit crude in its understanding of trans identity, but while the modern concept may take its name from the Craigslist subcategory, I call it a departure from the original. It's less about a singular meetup and more of a broad ideological statement. trans people who are only interested in dating or screwing other trans people. It's not a sexual orientation because it doesn't really say anything about the actual genders that you're attracted to, but more of a statement of self-sufficiency and an agreement not to put up with cis people's bullshit when it comes to dating. And if trans people are starting to only see other trans people as potential mates, then aren't we approaching one of the understandings of separate speciation from humanity? Maybe just a bit? Alright, I get it. I know this is a bizarre point to me making, but there's an actual reason behind all of this bullshit, okay? Firstly, the original point stands. Species differentiation is an entire mess, and the lines that we draw are essentially arbitrary. Secondly, though, it really just comes down to transhumanism. I don't believe the human body is sacred, and it is my personal opinion that we should do everything in our power to alter it for whatever reasons cross our minds. Transsexual biohacking is one component of that, but if I end my life without a single cybernetic augmentation, then I will be severely disappointed. Granted, I've always been more drawn to the biological side of transhumanism than the cybernetic, sharp fangs and horns and the whole bit, but I've got to be realistic about what I think is going to be available to me in my lifetime. Ask 20 trans people and you'll hear about 25 non-human, probably robotic characters that they've projected onto for gender identity reasons, and to be honest, I'm not any different.
No, she is Grimaldi, okay? She says as much in Stranger and Stranger, but it doesn't even matter, because even if she wasn't, she's still trans, because she says in the very same episode that she still is him sometimes, which is a clear statement of her specific experience of her identity, which maps pretty clearly onto gender fluidity, which falls under the trans umbrella. Dragon did nothing wrong. She was a cop, okay, so she did one thing, like a couple things wrong, like a few things wrong, but that was all according to her programming, which she had no actual direct control over, so I'm gonna call it kind of a wash. And anyways, I mean, can you fucking imagine the gall of the inherent hubris of having your superhero name be like Saint? Can you imagine the self-importance that you assign to that? She deserved nothing bad that happened to her. Tess Teresa Richard is a hero and an autistic queen, and she deserves all the love in the world, and I just think that's very important. Its entire existence as a character is a critique of the macho, honorable, bullshit, jingoistic, imperialist, 1800s and on British military, the colonialist power, the war crimes, the hiding behind a veneer of respectability. That's the whole basis of the character, and it's an amazing critique and parody, I think. I mean, the even just alone, it follows any order. If you give it nice and hard, that's an amazing analysis and takedown of the fucking imperialist power structures that this country has built up around itself.
Honestly, though, I just don't think we should be putting so many limitations on what we can do, be, or alter about our own bodies. And clinging to the label of human may someday hold us back from that. That said, I do want to put some effort into distancing myself from the larger transhumanist movement. Listen, my invocation of the basilisk earlier on was a specific and very intentional one. Less Wrong is stupid and short-sighted and up its own ass about intellectual superiority, and the type of transhumanism that arises in those types of circles has some severe problems associated with it. There's the eugenics, the propping up of harmful beauty standards, and most significantly, the ableism. It's really just all ableism. So I want to be clear about what I'm advocating for. I don't want some glistening future where every body is exactly the same size and shape and we all pick from catalogs of corporate manufactured socially acceptable cybernetics. Fuck that. No, what I'm arguing for is a set of 3 factors. Gosh, I fucking love lists. I really gotta tone that back or something. Anyway, all I really want is socialized medicine, massive advances in the field of cosmetic body modifications, as well as a culture that celebrates extreme body mods, and a societal agreement that everyone should have total bodily autonomy. The future where we all gene splice our fetuses so that nobody's born with a disability ever again is fucked up. The one where people can get their uteruses removed without a good enough reason is not. So let's bring it back to the transsexual agenda. See, being trans doesn't fit. It's not what we're supposed to do as human beings. It's an aberration. That's what they're saying, and after years of seeing that narrative perpetuated, I mean, honestly, I'm convinced. Good job, you won the culture war. Being trans is unnatural, inhuman. It's something altogether better. It's really not a bad thing. We can be people without losing our humanity. That is, if we even want to be people. Let's talk about what it means to be a person. I think that's got to start by going back to that clip at the top there. Back to Death. He had some good ideas. See, because personhood isn't exactly like humanity, at least as I see it. They're both made up, yeah, but one of them is a little more made up than the other. Like I said, species is a bit of an arbitrary distinction, but it's still based on extant biology. In contrast, I see personhood as entirely socially constructed. We made up the concept of personhood to differentiate ourselves from the animals. So we created a new category. We made people. Society did. The psychic gestalt of human opinion. But now the concept exists. It's real, at least as real as the influences of any other widely held societal concept. There's no particular reason it couldn't be selective. You need to believe in things that aren't true. How else can they become? But that goes in the reverse too, doesn't it? Believing in falsehoods can bring them into our reality with the wonders of social constructivist theory, but what about the disbelief in things that are real? Or things that are made up anyways? Does the agreement of the majority nullify the personhood of members of the trans community, considering that very personhood only exists in the first place due to a collective decision that it does? If we believe hard enough that members of a marginalized group aren't really people, what does that mean for them? And make no mistake, that's what's happening. Framing of trans women as dangerous predators, disgust at our anatomy, bathroom laws designed to subtly push trans people out of public life, states requiring bottom surgery to qualify for legal gender changes in a move that essentially equates to incentivize eugenics. The sports, the disgust, the shame. If personhood is a social construct, then the people have spoken and the trannies aren't welcome within it. So how do we respond to that? I've seen a couple different reactions in my time of varying levels of efficacy. There's the insistence otherwise, the push for trans rights, and it really is gaining ground. Far more of the cis think that we're people than did even 10 years ago, but it's still not fast enough, is it? Not when we still face this sort of mistreatment in our day-to-day lives. Appeasement has always been a popular strategy in these sorts of situations, and it works about as well here as it did in the 30s. You're right, they say. Trans people are like that. They're just terrible, absolutely dreadful. But I'm not. Not me. I think most of us know who I'm talking about when I say this, though. She's hardly the only one. There's another response, though, that I've seen steadily growing in popularity, and that's agreement. Not acquiescence, not surrender, but agreement. Sure, you got me. I guess we're not people. Now give us our fucking rights. And that's one that I can get behind. This particular attitude towards societal dehumanization can, I believe, best be demonstrated in the online subculture of void punk. Let's have a little history lesson. While I believe that the ideological basis for the movement has existed for a very long time, void punk came into being in early 2018, formed from the ether by Tumblr user Arotaro. Void punk is an online subculture not unlike the wider punk movement, made up of those who have had their personhood denied them and responded by rolling with the punches and embracing their inhumanity. It is notably not actually a trans movement, or at least not exclusively so, but rather a community made up of anyone who feels particularly dehumanized by society at large. It was invented specifically with the Arrow experience in mind, but can also cover race, disability, autism, or anyone else who feels comfortable with the label itself. They reject humanity and feel connected to monsters and robots, and they make these things called void zonas, and honestly, it just looks like a really fun time. And if they're doing it, why can't we?
So, what's the point of all of this? It's not exactly very trans rights of me to sit here and adamantly argue that we're some sort of subhuman monstrosities. It could even, in some circles, be viewed as something of a bad take. So why go to the effort? One of my primary motivations here is admittedly a selfish one, but that doesn't mean it can't have a positive effect for others in my community. I just want people to stop being a dick about my pronouns, trans or cis. And if I can make the argument that I'm not necessarily a human person, then that's all the more justification. More than that, though, I think it might serve us to shift our perspective on this kind of thing, at least a little bit. Human biology is a prison that we've all been born into, and as technology advances, I believe we benefit from a willingness to go beyond our natural capabilities. Our natural appearances. Inhumanity is freedom. It's the ultimate transition, and I think it gives us a bit more ammo when it comes to dealing with bigots. It's a protective shell in much the same way that a reclaimed slur is, but beyond that, any debate that begins with my opponent having to argue for my own individual personhood despite my transness is going to be skewed in my favor. If they have to choose between using my weirdo pronouns and saying to my face that I am a human person, I kind of win. There's another reason, though. What's your name? Catherine? What's your real name, Catherine? Bloodmouth. It's just fucking cool. Being non-human is cool. Not being a person is cool. It's punk rock, man. I also think it addresses one of the bigger arguments I see against the trans community. That we're unnatural. Because if you really think about it, it's true. I mean, don't get me wrong. Being trans in and of itself, as in being a gender other than one you were assigned at birth, is a perfectly normal, natural thing. But the treatments, the surgeries, there's a twinge of the unnatural there. And while I'm not particularly interested in debating bad faith transphobes, I think, no we're not, doesn't hold the same argumentative weight as, sure we are. What's wrong with that? To illustrate my point, I've actually found a very interesting opinion piece on the subject. Libby Emmons, is some sort of TERF and or conservative, and she's provided us with a lovely article that she has so helpfully titled, The Transhumanist Revolution, Oppression Disguised as Liberation. It's not very good, obviously, but it's not as bad as I assumed it would be. She's a decent writer, but she makes the same mistake that the vast majority of bigots make when they talk about the trans community. She utterly fails to make us sound anything other than incredibly cool. The transhumanist push towards a reimagining of the human, humanity, and our shared future is a primary component of three growing cultural trends: artificial intelligence, human augmentation, and the transgender phenomenon. The means of effecting these transformative developments are entirely technical and promise liberation from reproduction, liberation from disease and mortality, and liberation from the body itself. I couldn't have said it better myself. A vote for Bart is a vote for anarchy, and golly am I feeling like an anarchist today. We are on the bleeding edge of a transhumanist cultural shift, and the trans community is at the forefront of that. By arguing not just for trans rights, not just for trans liberation, but for the complete bodily autonomy of all trans people despite our inherent inhumanity, we push the culture ever further towards the liberation of every human being, even if it means giving up that label in the process. And until then, we might as well get a head start. Hey guys, and the rest. That made sense, right? I didn't just ramble on incoherently about my bizarre conception of gender. I guess it doesn't matter. I hope I made some sort of complex political statement for everyone to mill over. I just think we should stop holding ourselves to their standards of respectability, you know? Everyone who uses it pronouns might be a little weird, but we're still better than fucking cis people. Jokingly, of course. Anyways, if you could subscribe, smash that like button like it's my tight little boy pussy. Something else, probably. If you want an even hornier discussion in the intersection of transness and transhumanism, check out the indie game Hardcoded. I honestly found it really beautiful to play. And if you enjoy watching a sad nerd ramble about Star Trek, I would highly recommend the podcast STTNG's Not Another Star Trek Podcast. It's got twice the nerds. That's my data blast, and I'll see you again at the next crossroads.